Hello and welcome to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host Manny Maradiege, bringing you guys some more topics to discuss about here today on today's episode. Talking some more NFL rule changes. I'm going to talk to you guys about the running back market and some things that were said in regards to the running backs in the market and what the overall census is, the feeling around the running backs this year are. In the last part of the show, I'm going to bring in another topic to discuss the Giants and the recent rumors about trading up in the draft and what I make of it, my thoughts on it, and if it would ultimately be a good move for the Giants. Stick around for that conversation, as well as the Seahawks and their quarterback situation of their own. New head coach Mike McDonald wasn't 100% in on both the quarterbacks that they have currently on their roster, and I'm going to break down more of what he said and what it could mean for Geno Smith and Drew Lock. That's all coming to you guys on today's episode. But before I start on today's episode, I want to remind you guys to please use the tip and donations link with any questions that you may have during the show. We got a new tip and donations link, as you can see on the screen now. The tip and donations link is GSMC Sports or GSMCpodcast.net. I got to get used to saying that. It's GSMCpodcast.net with any questions or comments that you may have during the show. This just makes sure I'm able to see your question. It pops up on the chat box here to my right, and I'm able to interact with you guys during the show, and it makes it easier for me. And not only that, it's a massive help for the show. Not only this one, but all the shows around the network, and it's greatly appreciated every time we get to use that link, and anytime you guys come in with a question and use that tip and donations link during any of our shows. But with that being said, I could jump into that first story I talked about before, which is the running backs and what the general census is around them heading into free agency. The biggest report coming from ESPN and Adam Schefter, I believe was the first one to report it, was that the running backs, none of the big name running backs in this year's draft, the free agency, Tony Pollard, Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs, Austin Eckler, are all not expected to be franchise tagged by any of their current teams. And that was pretty big news on its own. But I have some quotes here from some members of NFL teams that, commented on the running backs and, kind of just got me to think about the running back situation and just what surrounds the running backs, because a lot of these guys say one thing and then their actions might show a different thing with the way the running back market is set up now and how a lot of people feel it's not fair to running backs. But one NFL member from the Ravens said that, He said, could you imagine Saquon Barkley and Lamar Jackson in the same backfield for the running game? That was a quote from ESPN's Jeremy Fowler. And another quote that was said from the new offensive coordinator from the Chargers was that he also asked a rhetorical question, and he said almost the same thing. Can you imagine Justin Herbert with a great running game? We don't know, but I can imagine what it might look like, so that's the kind of vision I have. That was Greg Roman, newly hired by Jim Harbaugh for the Chargers offensive coordinator position. And, the sentiment there is almost the same thing. They're basically saying the same thing about two, or really one, running back. The Ravens organization member mentioned Saquon Barkley. Greg Roman didn't mention anybody, but all the running backs, the top-end running backs in the free agency market are top-of-the-line guys. And, both of them are, anticipating having one of those guys. They want one of those guys, it seems like, by the comments that they made. And, that's how they make it seem. All the teams would probably say the same thing. A lot of teams in the NFL would probably say the same thing. We'd love a great running back. It would make the offense so much more different, better, more dynamic, having a guy that could do it all, like the Saquon Barkleys of the world, the Christian McCaffreys, the Derrick Henrys, the Austin Ecklers, I guess before last season, but leading up to last season, he was one of the top-end running backs. And, I think it's kind of funny when you see these guys say that, but the running back market is the way that it is, and it almost just you don't know where to stand on it. If these guys truly felt the way that they did, these organization members, um, these coaches, coordinators, if they felt a certain way about it, of course, most of them might not be making the decisions money wise and just team fit wise, looking long term. If they feel this way about it, you'd think they'd do everything that they can to get one of these guys on their team. And I think a lot of the fear, a lot of the sentiment behind that is that nobody wants to be the using an analogy, the guy that buys an expensive car or a car with a lot of mileage on it and having it just fall apart one day when they're driving on any given day on the road somewhere. They don't want to be the guy that overpays for one of these running backs and then they get really hurt or they just struggle with injuries during their time with that team. And then everybody questions, this is why we don't pay running backs. This is why this was a huge mistake for them to pay this team. I think that sentiment has gone too far in one direction, in my opinion, and that's where it stands currently. And I just don't think it's fair to really base them off of that point because a lot of these guys do so much for their teams. Of course, no one's going to be Christian McCaffrey on the 49ers, but the Saquons, the Derrick Henrys, like I mentioned, other guys on other teams, Alvin Kamara, Bijan Robinson that just got to the Atlanta Falcons. They get into these teams so early on, pretty young. Bijan Robinson's a young player. And unfortunately, you get situations like the one with Saquon, and he's been with the Giants, I think, like 5 years now, heading into year 6 or year 5, and he still hasn't gotten that big contract like a Derrick Henry has. Derrick Henry already got a pretty decently valued contract for a running back, and now he's on to his second, potentially away from the Titans. And that's almost the best case scenario that you can get at this point. I'm sure Christian McCaffrey will also get another contract down the line with the 49ers, but it's crazy to think how one or two of these running backs that are very great all-world talents, but they're still searching for that one contract. Josh Jacobs is almost in the same boat. He hasn't been in the league as long as Saquon, but he's another one that had a good year. Now he's coming off of a pretty rough year, and these organizations, all they need is one bad year, one year where it didn't look right. They might look slow, or because of the offensive line could have been bad, they didn't produce the same amount of numbers that they have in the past. They now get really skeptical and they won't pay for a top-end running back to get to where they need to be in their organization kind of fit. And again, that just seemed unfair to me in some aspect. And I think a lot of these teams, another thing with a lot of these teams is that they believe that they could just not overpay for a running back and potentially draft one or just find one in free agency somewhere. An unsigned draft pick that, makes it all the way through the draft, gets signed somewhere, and then you get, those stories you always see, an unsigned rookie making this sort of impact. You always see it at least once in the NFL, each NFL season. One of these crazy stories like a Jalen Warren or a Kyron Williams that really a lot of people don't know about, and they have great success with their team. And I think a lot of people in organizations want to go that route, and it's a lot easier said than done, obviously, because the chances of you finding a running back like that are a lot lower than I think people would really truly believe. And a lot of the running backs now, the ones that led the league in stats and production and all that stuff, they're all pretty highly drafted. I go back to saying Christian McCaffrey, Najee Harris was another one that was drafted in the first round, Derrick Henry, and just all these guys that produce and they were drafted really high and they validate being drafted that high, and then they get through 5 or 6 years of it and people just think they're done for some reason. And it's getting to a point now where the running backs have been more vocal about it, but it's getting harder and harder to see someone pay a lot of money for these teams. The Giants are one team, obviously, with Saquon that they're not going to franchise tag him again, obviously, like I said. but their general manager, Joe Shane, has uttered already in this week's NFL Combine that he would love to work out something with Saquon. They would love to keep him on the team. But there's always still that doubt, at least in my head, of, if you really truly mean that, how much do you value him? I'm sure Saquon thinks he's a $12 to $13 million guy, but are the Giants willing to pay that? Are they willing to lose Saquon and then really not have another running back on an already middle of the pack, bottom end of the pack kind of offense? There's questions around Daniel Jones that I'll talk about later in this episode. All those things come into my mind. Like, it seems so obvious that you have to keep Saquon on your team, but everyone is thinking that, he might just fall off. He might get an injury and then it's done for. It's a weird place where the NFL is with running backs and just thinking this way. All these running backs, without a doubt, are going to get signed somewhere, but it'll be interesting to see what the dynamic will be going forward with how much the first guy gets paid and then how much the next guy gets paid and so on and so forth. How these organizations really measure how they value these guys with each other. If one pays maybe too much for one guy, the other team might offer less or they might offer more just to make sure they get their own guy. It's an interesting dynamic in the NFL now that we see with the running backs, and wherever these running backs end up, I'm sure that they're still going to produce in the way that they have been just recently in their careers. Saquon is still 27 to 28 years old. He's still got at least 3 more good years in him, in my estimation. I know he's got in some ankles and knee injuries, but if he goes to the right situation, I have no doubt that he'll be great. It just depends on how much each of these teams are willing to pay and, risk, I guess, to an aspect on Saquon and the Derrick Henrys, the Josh Jacobs going forward. That's where the NFL is now with running backs. It's a weird spot. It's a delicate situation if you're negotiating for these contracts, but that's the NFL, at least right now, with the business side of it. Speaking on the NFL, that would bring me into the next topic I'm going to go into later in the show. The NFL potentially having another rule change coming this season. The league meetings are obviously in March, and there's another petition to get rid of a hip drop tackle in the NFL. And there's been a lot of noise made around that. A lot of people are voicing their concerns with it. People think it should have already been gone in the NFL. But all that and the topics around it, the conversations around it will all be coming up later on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. But now I'll send it to a quick break and bring you guys more football talk in just a few seconds.